Well, so special interest is a loaded term, right? My stakeholder is your special interest and vice versa. One way to think about it is that either all interests are special or none are. But if you think about it in terms of sort of traditional pluralist liberal theory, a lot of what politics is the play of interest groups, right? So this can be traced back to Madison's Federalist 10, right? Essentially we have interests bouncing off of interests, and what politics is the sort of epiphenomenal manifestation of that. It's the Congress is one of the places where those interests run into one another. Now that doesn't mean, even if you sort of accept that that's how politics is supposed to work, and I should say that throughout American history that's been one strand of thought. It's always been balanced, although they've waxed and waned in their relative influence, by a more sort of small r Republican theory of how politics should work, which suggests that politicians should be relatively insulated from pressure, from interests, from things like that. I think most of us, if we really sort of thought deeply about our own intuitions, would think that we want some kind of balance between the two. We don't want our politicians to be wholly unresponsive to their constituents, but maybe we don't want them to be completely responsive either. We want them to exercise some amount of independent judgment. Now that said, we all know that there are some interest groups that are influential, disproportionate to the number of actual human beings who are part of that interest group. Right, the wealthy have more powerful than the poor, but even in less obvious ways. So geographically concentrated groups tend to be able to exert their power more easily than geographically diffuse groups. Right, so if all the members of an interest group live together, first of all, they probably can elect their own member of the House of Representatives because they might be enough to sort of swing or control a district. But also it's easier for them to coordinate their behavior than it is for a widely dispersed group to coordinate its behavior. So there's all kinds of ways and all kinds of reasons that interest groups might have disproportionate power. And there's all kinds of reasons we might either be accepting or skeptical of that and want to sort of try to figure out ways to combat it.
Lobbyists and interest groups are an essential part of life in Washington. And they get a bad reputation, and some of that's well-deserved. But one of the most important things that special interest groups do is that they provide information. Any individual member of Congress is likely to be called upon to either consider or vote on up to 3,000 pieces of legislation in any given Congress. There's no way members of Congress can be experts on that number of bills, on that number of subject areas. And so they have to find outside experts who can help them figure out what the right decision is on those pieces of legislation. Interest groups can do that. When you have an interest group who has a focus on a particular policy area, the information that group can provide to a member might save dozens of hours of staff time. Now, the peril, of course, is that interest groups have to be absolutely honest and forthright, because if a member of Congress is burned by bad information, that interest group will never be able to have any kind of role to play with the Congress ever again. But interest groups are essential to providing that information. They are an important source of ideas about legislation for members of Congress, because ultimately they have members who are real people from all over the country. And so they often are able to articulate a need that could be very important for a member of Congress to have to recognize and address.
Nowadays, when we talk about polarization, I think we mean not only that there's a division about what to do within the nation among politicians about what the right policy path is, but that division then maps onto partisanship. So and oftentimes I find it convenient to think about the polarization under these two different scenarios. One without parties, just a vision about what good public policy should be, and then you add a dimension. If you organize the parties around that, then you have not only strong feelings about policy, but then what political parties give you is organizational capacity, then to organize people to the polls and then to use the mechanisms of government to enact laws along those lines. And what we've seen in the United States since, well, people time it in different ways, but baby steps in the late 1960s, and then growing, and really bursting into kind of full bloom mid-90s to 2000 has been a division first at the elite level and now increasingly at the popular level, where Democrats and Republicans really divide very strongly along partisan lines, and we can kind of characterize that. But the important part is the division along social policies. Actually, empirically, the strongest division between Democrats and Republicans now are along social policies, like around abortion. But that's also then become associated with strong divisions about, say, the size and the role of the federal government in the economy, how aggressive we should be in foreign policy. And so almost every issue now aligns Democrats and Republicans on two sides of things, and very strong divisions, which was not generally the case 1950s, 1960s by far. Implications of polarization are a couple, and here I would lay out what I would consider to be the consensus view, and what I would offer as an amendment to the consensus view. I think the consensus view that is easily seen in the news day in and day out is increasing difficulty in passing important national legislation, decreasing attention to the details of government, the turning of issues into issues rather than problems to be solved, and as fodder to be used in the next election. So, so the big implication is that we've moved from problem solving and policy making in the national discourse to finger pointing and name calling, and less attention to actually passing laws. So that's the consensus view. And there's a lot of moving parts in there, like how the filibuster works into that and all the rest, how primaries reinforce that, primary electorates, but that's kind of the thing. There's kind of an interesting amendment to this. Before the realignment that I mentioned that started in the 1960s, intellectuals, political scientists leading among them, but a lot of intellectuals actually decried the lack of ideological cohesion within parties. And indeed, Woodrow Wilson, a century before, also decried this. The argument being that if the parties are not ideological, then voters won't know how to make the proper choices when they go to the polling place, and the parties can take any position they want to. And that what we need in America are ideologically coherent parties so that voters will know which side to vote for, and that when there is a policy that fails, you can pin it on a party. If it succeeds, you can pin it on a party. And in this world, voters know what to do, and you have greater accountability. The problem with the pre-1965 party system and the lack of polarization is that it wasn't clear what the consequences of elections were. And therefore, democratic accountability was undermined. So, intellectuals have gotten what they asked for. We have gotten strongly, politically, partisanly, or ideologically divided parties. It's clear what's at stake. It's clear what the parties are going to do. It's clear that if you believe in abortion, you should vote for one party. It's clear that if you don't like abortion, you should vote for the other party. It's clear how these things go together. It's clear if a policy fails, who's responsible. So this should be a good world. This should be the world of party responsibility. And yet, it's one in which I think the general consensus is this is not a world we want to live in which policy is mostly people yelling at each other rather than solving problems. We have great accountability, but governing has suffered.
you